Welcome to everybody. Some of you may have heard the previous talks I've done based on my book, 200 Years of Dulwich Radicalism, which is available in local bookshops for £10. In previous sessions, I've covered Dulwich communists and also suffragettes, pacifists and Republicans, a couple of whom reappear in their later life as social reformers. I've got quite a lot to get through, so I will be moving at speed. I hope you can hear me clearly. That's why I'm quite close to the computer. So I'm going to start with George and Harriet Grote. George Grote, the historian of Greece and MP for the City of London between 1832 and 1841, lived at Dulwich Wood, later known as Wood Hall on College Road, south of the toll gate, between 1832 and 1837. The house was hit by a bomb during the Second World War and was demolished in 1955, the site being redeveloped as Woodhall Drive. Grove was the leading radical, a follower of Jeremy Bentham, who originated the ideology of utilitarianism. They were known as a group as the Philosophical Radicals. They included James Mill, the economist and historian of India, his son, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, the Radical MP for East Cornwall, Sir William Molesworth, John Arthur Roebuck, MP for Bath and later for Sheffield, Charles Buller, the MP for Lisker, Joseph Parkes, the Birmingham Radical, Lord Durham, who was later governor of British North America, otherwise known as Canada, lawyer Charles Austin, some journalists, but also included George's wife, Harriet, who was a writer in her own right and was known as the hostess of the group. They also had a house basically in Whitehall. This is the leaflet from, or announcement from his original City of London election, where he was elected together with other radicals. His main role, as well as historical role, was as the leading campaigner for the secret ballot. The secret ballot had been one of the propositions put forward by the Chartists, but he basically led the campaign for the secret ballot in Parliament, starting off with the ballot bill in 1837. And basically for every year he was in Parliament, he attempted to get the secret ballot vote through. So putting up bills, in fact, as early as 1833, right through to 1839. He never achieved a majority for that, and in fact he died just before the secret ballot was introduced in the 1871. In various coverage, they gave examples in the journals, the Spectator journal in this case, of what a ballot box could look like. This is also a cartoon of George Grote holding up an urn in which votes would be collected. George Grote, as I say, wrote a massive history of Greece. You can see the volumes there, but Harriet also wrote books, both a biography of Sir William Molesworth, the MP, a biography of her husband, and also basically history of the philosophical radicals. There were views. Augustus Hare, a commentator at the time, referred to Harriet as she was to the last one of the most original women in England, shrewd, generous, and excessively vain. Another commentator, the later historian, G.M. Young, wrote, in Mrs. Grote, who would have been a far more effective member of Parliament than her husband, who sat with her red stockings higher than her head, discomfited a dinner party by saying, disemboweled, quite bold and plain, and knew when a hoop was off a pail in the back kitchen, the great lady is formidably ascendant. Her comments on the house in Dulwich are interesting. She described it as naked and a wilderness, not papered, painted or warmed or anything. They paid £4,500 for the house and spent £2,000 on making the house into an attractive country residence. They also rented 5 more acres, which are now part of the Dulwich and Sydenham golf course. Right, I will move on swiftly to my next social reformer, Charles Buxton, who was a critic of slavery and also a critic of colonial maladministration. He was MP for Surrey East between 1865 and 1871. You may not be aware, Dulwich residents, that in fact Dulwich was part of the Surrey East constituency because it was regarded as a rural area up to 1885 when the Camberwell South Dulwich more urban constituency was created. Charles Buxton was the son of the brewer and reforming MP Thomas Fowle Buxton. The Buxton family owned the Tomb and Hanbury Buxton Brewery in Brick Lane, Spitalfields. His father was one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement, and one of the achievements of the son was to establish the anti-slavery monument dedicated to his father, which is in the gardens on the river just outside Parliament. Charles followed his father's reforming politics, educated privately, went to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1841. He wrote a memoir of his father, but as an MP, he was a reforming independent, a liberal, but not necessarily viewed as a radical. He supported the disestablishment of the Church of England and security of tenure for Irish peasant farmers. He was opposed to the then Foreign Minister and Prime Minister Lord Palmerston's aggressive imperial policy. He preferred peace to war, though he recognized any country had the right to defense. He was an enthusiast for a volunteer citizen army, the volunteer movement being very popular during the Crimean War of 1853-6. And Charles Buxton was actually commissioned in the Tower Hamlets Rifle Volunteers. He published a number of works, including a book of ideas of the day on policy, which were mainly commenting on the ideas of others. But he was also involved in the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. He was interested in the West Indies and actually wrote a book on colonial government in the West Indies. In 1865, there was a controversy over how the governor of Jamaica, Edward Eyre, had actually suppressed a revolt by West Indian natives, and this caused major divisions in the British political left at the time, with some liberal figures such as the Christian socialist Thomas Hughes, who was also an MP, supporting, well, they were members of what was called the Jamaica Committee, which was campaigning against the government and seeking to prosecute the governor, whereas some of the radicals took the opposite position. So it actually was a major split in the radical movement at the time. Charles Buxton combined his affection for animals with a love of hunting. He designed his own country seat in Surrey. In 1867, Buxton fell off his horse while hunting, suffered concussion from which he never recovered. Apparently, at one point, he asked the secretary to shoot him, though this assisted suicide attempt failed. He died in 1871, with his wife actually dying on the same day. One of their sons, Sidney Buxton, became a leading political writer and radical Liberal MP, becoming Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, Postmaster General, President of the Board of Trade, and Governor of South Africa, when the South African provinces were brought together after the Boer War. My next group are Alan Octavian Hume, George Newell, and Dabadai Naoroji. I wrote an article in the journal on these Dulwich, the connections between Dulwich and Indian nationalism quite recently. Hume was a retired Indian civil servant, lived at the Chalet 4 Kingswood Drive, and also founded the South London Botanical Institute in Norwood Road, which is still with us. He was chairman of the Dulwich Liberal Association between 1894 and 1912, and the most prominent radical liberal in Dulwich in the 1890s and 1900s, leading the Liberal challengers in 6 parliamentary elections. The Liberals, I have to say, have never won a parliamentary seat in Dulwich, although they came quite close to it in 1906. Hume took retirement from the Indian Civil Service in 1882, but stayed in India. He had become involved in the Theosophy movement, which is a kind of Eastern-based religious mystical movement introduced to India by Helen Blavatsky and Henry Olcott in the 1870s. Hume basically became part of this campaign, believing in a universal brotherhood. He abandoned alcohol, became a vegetarian, and stopped shooting birds. He was a collector of stuffed birds on a fairly major scale, it's fair to say. He, however, in 1885, in his involvement in Indian politics, became the founder of the Indian National Congress, Hume becoming the General Secretary, a post he retained for nearly 10 years. He argued for both political and economic reform, but also sought to broaden out the basis of the reform movement by bringing together townspeople and peasant proprietors, Hindus and Muslims. He worked very closely with a number of other Indian nationalists, including the gentleman in the middle picture, who was George Yule, who actually also, when he was in England, lived at Springfield, 9 Kingswood Drive, just across from Hume's house. Yule, however, was, as I say, mainly based in Calcutta as part of a family business set up by his father, who was a linen and wool draper. Yule became involved in Calcutta municipal politics, actually becoming at one stage Sheriff of Calcutta. He was actually invited to be president of the Indian National Congress in 1888. At that time, the Indian National Congress included, shall we say, progressive Indian civil servants as well as Indian nationalists. Now, the third person in the picture clearly is an Indian Parsi, Devadatta Naoroji, who is often regarded as the founder of Indian nationalism, who at one time lived in Annerley. At the time, Annerley was actually part of the Dulwich parliamentary constituency. And Naoroji was elected MP for Finsbury and actually became the first non-white member of the British Parliament. So he combined his role as a Liberal MP in London with his role as leader of the nationalist movement in India. There were other links. One of the leading members of the Indian Congress was Sir Henry Cotton, a former Indian civil servant, and in 1910, the Liberal Party in Dulwich selected his son, Evan Cotton, to stand for the parliamentary seat. He was, however, unsuccessful, but there was also earlier a proposal that Lal Mohan Ghosh, who was an Indian National Congress delegate effectively to Britain, who basically spent his time trying to persuade MPs to support Indian self-government. Lal Mohan Ghosh was at one time proposed by the Radicals to be a parliamentary candidate for Dulwich, but was actually selected by the Deptford Radicals and actually fought the Deptford seat, though he was unsuccessful in doing so, very nearly actually becoming the MP. I mean, that was actually well before Naoroji's candidacy. So Lal Mohan Ghosh was nearly the first Indian MP and could have been, as I say, was nearly the candidate in Dulwich. So I'm going to move on to a very different group of individuals, and these are Thomas Scott and Charles Voysey, who were both theists. Theists is quite difficult to define, but were individuals who believed in a God, believed in some form of religion, but not the form of Christianity expounded by the Church of England or other Christian groups. I mean, some of them were within the Church of England, but were regarded as not just radicals, but in some cases as heretics. Thomas Scott lived in Farquhar Road in Gypsy Hill from 1870 at 11 the Terrace. His home became a centre of a group of secularists, theists, and radical intellectuals. He was born in France and brought up as a Roman Catholic, actually serving as a page at the court of the French Bourbon King Charles X. Independent means, he travelled widely, spending time in among the North American Indians, apparently camping out for 2 years without sleeping in a house. He was interested in the history of the Bible and learnt Hebrew while also studying pagan mythology. Returning to England in the 1850s, Scott settled in Ramsgate. He published a series of pamphlets, subjects including the development of beliefs and ceremonies at the time of Solomon. He claimed to be a clergyman, but sought to discredit the Church of England. He then became a friend of another theist, Charles Voysey, who at the time lived in Dulwich at Camden House in Dulwich Village. Scott became Voysey's patron, publishing a set of sermons called The Sling and the Stone. In 1870, Scott moved from Ramsgate to Farquhar Road so he could be close to Voysey. Scott became Voysey's main financial supporter in Voysey's initiative to establish a theistic church. Voysey's theological position, and I will move on to Voysey now. This is 2 photos of him, a cartoon of him, and at the bottom is his theistic church, which was first at St George's Hall in Langham Place, and then in Swallow Street, Piccadilly, which actually continued for 30 years. The services apparently were quite similar to Anglican services. Voysey was not radical in his politics, but actually an ardent conservative unionist. Voysey's son, who's probably better known than the father, was the architect C.F.A. Voysey, who was educated at Dulwich College, continuing to live in Dulwich before moving to Bedford Park in West London in 1885, one of the sort of early garden suburbs. Thomas Scott, returning to Scott, was a close friend of the socialist, corporator, and secularist George Jacob Holyoake. In his memoir, Holyoake records that it was a close friend, I should say, of Bishop Colenso, who was the radical Bishop of Natal. So as the group met, Scott published a wide range of authors, including Colenso. He himself wrote an English Life of Jesus, as well as a set of commentaries on the Bible, which I showed you in the previous slide. While liberal in his theology, according to Holyoake, who was a radical, Scott was also a Tory in politics. Holyoake described Scott, I'll go back to Scott, as being as an old man with beautiful white hair and eyes like those of a hawk gleaming from under shaggy eyebrows. He'd been a man of magnificent physique, and though his frame was then enfeebled, the splendid lion-like head kept its impressive strength and beauty, and was told of a unique personality. Scott died in Upper Norwood in December 1878. Now I'm going to move on now to Annie Besant, who is probably one of the better known individuals I'm covering. Annie Besant was a secularist, a socialist, theosophist, and Indian nationalist, so shared some interests with some of the previous individuals I just mentioned. She lived at 39 Colby Road, West Dulwich, from 1874. she left her husband, a rural clergyman who was orthodox and authoritarian, and questioned her religious beliefs. And Besant then became a co-leader of the secularist movement with Charles Bradlaugh and Henry Aveling. Aveling was to become the common law husband of Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter. Annie Besant became attracted to the theism of Charles Voysey and of Thomas Scott, and in fact moved in with Scott when she was sort of fleeing from her husband. Annie Besant in her early years published a very wide range of pamphlets. She wrote for the National Reformer, the secularist journal, published pamphlets through the Freethought Publishing Company with titles such as Liberty, Equality and Fraternity, English Republicanism, the English Land System, Landlords, Tenant Farmers and Labourers, and also on the political status of women. She was also involved in the attacks, critiquing the aggressive colonial policy given the British invasions then of Afghanistan, the Transvaal, Egypt, the Sudan, and also she opposed coercion in Ireland. In 1884, Besant moved from secularism to join the Marxist organization, the Social Democratic Federation. She was very active in socialist and radical politics in London, became close to a number of leading early socialists, including leaders of the Fabian Society, such as George Bernard Shaw, and she actually served from 1885 on the Fabian Society Executive Committee. As well as being involved in extra-parliamentary action, the various demonstrations, she was well known, as I say, for her writing, and was seen as a leader of the early socialist movement. From 1888, she actually established her own journal called The Link, a journal for the servants of men, in collaboration with the leading popular journalist W.T. Stead. She also was elected, I should say, notwithstanding, to the London School Board, together with a group of other radicals, including the Christian socialist Stuart Headlam. So she basically was a campaigner to expand education in London. Her manifesto was sort of focused on the campaign for no more hungry children. I asked the electors to vote for me and the non-electors to work for me because women are wanted on the board and there are far too few women candidates. She actually came top of the poll in Tower Hamlets, where she stood, with over 15,000 votes. She also campaigned for, should we say, non-religious or non-faith specific education within the London schools. In 1893, Annie Besant, by which time she had moved across to being a theosophist, she then moved to India and basically was very involved in Indian national politics and self-governance, and establishing the Indian Home Rule League in 1916, and also becoming herself president of the Indian National Congress. I think the first and only woman to be appointed to that role. So just some of her pamphlets. I've got a vast number of these, I have to say. Her path to atheism and her arguments on rural population. What I didn't cover was her role with Bradlaugh in supporting and publishing pamphlets on birth control, which got her into, should we say, some serious difficulty and a set of legal trials. But I will refer to that again in a moment, because I'm coming on to others who were involved in campaigns for reform of legislation relating to sex and what was called social hygiene. So I'm picking up here Havelock Ellis, who I didn't include in the book, but I would probably well write an article on Havelock Ellis for the journal, because Havelock Ellis lived in Holmdene Avenue, between number 24 Holmdene Avenue, between 1929 and 1937. He was then aged 70. He'd moved from Dover Mansions in Brixton, having previously also lived in Penge and Annerley. He was actually funded to buy the house by the American birth control campaigner, Margaret Sanger. I wrote it down at the moment. Right, so yeah, Margaret Sanger. By then he had actually become known as the leading English sexologist. He trained in medicine. In his early years, he was quite involved in progressive politics, becoming initially secretary of an organization called the Progressive Association, which was a group of progressive intellectuals, which later developed into the Fellowship of the New Life, which was a discussion group, I think it's best to describe it as, founded by the Scottish mystic Thomas Davidson, which brought together a whole range of progressives, some of whom split off to form the Fabian Society. One of Havelock Ellis's early roles at the time was to compile a secular hymns of progress, which didn't mention God, and included a song called Onward Brother, March Still Onward. He published a book called The New Spirit, which included works of a number of progressive thinkers at the time. Diderot, Heine, Whitman, Ibsen and Tolstoy were the subjects. That was in 1890. But by then he'd moved on from that kind of political commentary to developing not just an interest, but possibly an obsession with writing about the psychology of sex. He actually published 7 very detailed volumes of case studies of sexual behavior, including, as I say, a number of perversions that I was blissfully unaware of, and wouldn't necessarily encourage reading of these vast tomes. But he was also increasingly sort of regarded as one of the leading intellectuals and reformers of the time. I mentioned earlier the Fellowship of the New Life, and that was mainly because he met through these original intellectual circles Edith Lees, who is then shown with Havelock Ellis in the middle of the picture at the top, and on her own on the right. Edith Lees is an important person in her own right. She became secretary at one stage of the Fellowship of the New Life. Her co-secretary at the time being none other than James Ramsay MacDonald, who in 1924 was to become the first Labour Prime Minister. The Fellowship of the New Life actually established a commune in Doughty Street in Belgravia, where Ramsay MacDonald and Edith Lees, amongst others, lived, 29 Doughty Street. Edith Lees actually wrote a novel in 1908, which is effectively a satire on the communal life and the behavior of many of her colleagues and socialists and anarchists of the time. They were close friends, Ellis and Edith Lees, of individuals such as Edward Carpenter, and also people like William Morris, friends of Olive Schreiner. In fact, Havelock Ellis' the closest companion before he met Edith Lees was Olive Schreiner, the South African socialist feminist. Edith Lees also published a series of books herself, including a book called The New Horizon in Love and Light, and also a study of a number of what you called pre-modern seers, including James Hinton, who was a religious mystic, Edward Carpenter, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Lees actually died in 1916, so this was well before Havelock Ellis moved into the Home Dean Avenue property. Havelock Ellis wrote a autobiography, which was really mainly a study of his relationship with Edith Lees. By the time Havelock Ellis moved into Home Dean Avenue, he had a sort of companion come nurse called Françoise Lafitte Pulley, who was French and basically was a writer and a translator. The nature of their relationship is probably something best not described in a lecture of this kind, just as the relationship between Havelock Ellis and Edith Lees is an interesting one. Edith Lees is regarded as one of the most public lesbians of the period, but was actually collaborated very closely in an interesting, shall we say, marriage with Havelock Ellis, although sometimes they actually live separately. Now, while I'm on this group of reformers, I will also refer to Alice Vickery, Charles Drysdale, and George Drysdale. Now, I did cover Alice Vickery briefly in the talk I gave on suffragettes, because she was active in the suffrage movement. But for the purposes of this session, I'm going to focus on her medical and sex reform activity. Alice Vickery and Charles Drysdale, who had a, shall we say, common law marriage, everybody assumed that they were married, were both medically trained. In fact, Charles Drysdale had actually at one time been Alice Vickery's medical tutor cum supervisor. George Drysdale was Charles's brother, and the significance here is the fact that George Drysdale wrote a book called The Elements of Social Science, this being, sorry, modern edition, The Physical, Sexual and Natural Religion. It was published pseudonymously. In fact, it was generally thought that it was his brother Charles Drysdale who was the author. This, again, is a personal study of sexual behavior with extensive descriptions of medical treatment of, should we say, sexual diseases, incredibly detailed and not necessarily what would now be regarded as medically sound information, but was the first of its kind and was very controversial. The Drysdales were also involved in sort of campaigns, well, basically campaigns for birth control, and published pamphlets arguing for birth control. One was called, which I got for summer, The State Remedy for Poverty. The book that the actual book I've heard to was regarded by some as the Bible of the brothel, and actually sold 80,000 copies. Drysdale and Alice Vickery were both involved in the trial that I mentioned earlier of Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant for publishing a pamphlet on birth control called The Fruits of Philosophy, although they weren't the authors of it. So the Drysdale and Vickery were witnesses at that trial, actually supporting Besant and Bradlaugh. Alice Vickery, in her later life, as they became involved in the suffrage movement, but also became a campaigner against the Contagious Diseases Act, supporting the campaign of Josephine Butler. She also campaigned on the issue of legal penalties for the illegitimate through an organization known as the Legitimization League. She actually survived till 1979. But I should have said the group of them lived at Carson Road, 28 Carson Road in West Dulwich. Interestingly, the residents seem to put their own blue plaque in the window. It's not an official one. Perhaps I will be trying to get blue plaques for some of these others. So this is a picture of Charles Drysdale and Alice Vickery when they were younger. The cover of the book written by George Drysdale, who you can see his name is written in because it was just given as a doctor of medicine. And there is, as I say, a plaque on another building. So this is their son, Charles Vickery Drysdale, with pictures of the two brothers at the top, and Alice Vickery and family bottom left. The son, Charles Vickery Drysdale, founded the Neo-Malthusian Association, which was moving beyond Thomas Malthus's position, which was that the population would self-correct as people starved, but basically arguing for birth control, and also the family as a whole became very involved in the eugenics movement, with the debate about basically state intervention, either through we say mandatory birth control as well as voluntary birth control, which was a very contentious debate. But as some of you may be familiar, in the years before the First World War, there was widespread support among leading intellectuals, including leading socialists, for what was called eugenics, which was basically a state control of selective breeding, which gets you into obviously very difficult ethical territory, but was supported by people like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw and Carl Pearson, who was basically the professor of eugenics at University College London. This is the obituary of Alice Vickery in the Wynne's Leader from January 1929. I'm now going to move on to some other reformers, starting with a very sort of different type of social reform. This is Marion Saxton Sales, who was feminist and tax reformer, who lived at Beltwood House, which is Sydenham, near the Woodhouse pub. She actually was a member of the Land and Nationalisation Society and wrote a pamphlet, The Master Key of Social Reform, which was arguing for land nationalisation and for introduction of radical inheritance tax. She was an inspirer, in my view, of Ebenezer Howard, the founder of modern British town planning, who lived in Dulwich between 1879 and 1885 at 4 Ildersley Grove, Croxted Road. Not a professional planner, his job was actually as a shorthand writer in the House of Commons. In 1898, he published a book, Tomorrow, A Peaceful Plan for Real Reform, and that basically is still seen as the sort of founding document of British town planning. He founded the Garden Cities Association, which is now the Town and Country Planning Association, as well as the International Planning, Housing and Planning Federation. You can see the relative grave. That's Garden Cities Tomorrow, which was the reprint of his original book, and also his marvelous drawing of how he saw garden cities being developed. I'm going to have to move really quickly because I am fairly short of time. This is Henry Aldridge, who was a housing and planning reformer. He was born, lived at 86 Oglander Road in East Dulwich, so moved to Leicester in 1906. He was secretary of the National Housing and Reform Council, which also had links to the Land Nationalisation Society, which I've just referred to. He collaborated with the Fabian Society and with William Stedman, who was a Radical London County Council member, to publish material on how to deal with overcrowding in London. And he published the sort of main documentation for housing and planning just as the first legislation was being introduced in 1909. So this is his volume, The Case for Town Planning. He also published after the First World War a national housing manual. He organised an exhibition of sort of new cottage development in Sheffield. This is a plan from that. Right, I'm going to have to not going to be able to get through everybody actually in the time, but I'll try and speak for another 5 or 10 minutes or so. I've got here Charles Masterman, who was the proponent of new liberalism. He was a journalist. He was Liberal candidate in the 1903 Dulwich by-election. He was defeated in Dulwich, but later became an MP and a junior minister in the Atlas government in 1910, and briefly a cabinet minister in 1914. He was editor of several books, became the leading proponent of new liberalism, a liberalism which abandoned laissez-faire and recognized the need for state intervention to provide a welfare state. At the time he was selected as Dulwich parliamentary candidate for the Liberals, he worked at a university settlement in Camberwell. He published a series of books, including edited books with other contributors on, well, the most famous book I think of his is called The Heart of Empire, which was demonstrating at the time everybody was concerned about how the British Empire was run, pointing out the poverty in certain areas of London and the rest of the country, England. Right, these are a number of his books, covering a very wide area of policy. Alison Neelands, I did cover in the suffragette talk, that after becoming a militant suffragette and being arrested and put in prison a number of times, after the First World War, she was very involved in campaigning for equal citizenship through a number of organizations, but mainly through her role of the Association for Social Hygiene, where she campaigned for, this is all her suffrage pictures, where she campaigned on the sort of issues of treatment of women, medical issues. She was very active in campaigning against prostitution and the trafficking of women, and actually contributed to the work of the League of Nations. Now, the last one I've probably got time to cover is John and Alice Harris, who lived at 191 East Village Grove from 1910 to 1921. John Harris and Alice Harris were missionaries in the Congo and were very actively involved in exposing the treatment of the native population at the time of firstly King Leopold of Belgium being the private owner of the Congo, and then the role of the Belgian government. John Harris became secretary of the Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society. He was also at one stage president of the Dulwich Liberal Association, and later in life was elected as a member of parliament. And this is some of the images that they used to argue against the behavior of government and companies in the Congo. Rather grim photos, I have to say. Alice Harris took all the photographs herself, and it's probably the first case of the use of photography to expose that kind of maltreatment. This is her with a group of relatively happy young children, a bizarre photograph perhaps, but at least most of those children have still got their limbs attached, unlike others she dealt with. The final two I was going to comment on very quickly was Arthur Creech Jones. I covered him because in a previous talk because he was one of the leading conscientious objectors, as well as being the founder of the Independent Labour Party in Dulwich and the first secretary of the Camberwell Trades Council. He lived in Dulwich most of his life, from starting in Keston Road near Goose Green, and in the 1920s and 30s he lived at 79 Red Coast Hill. He worked for a trade union after he was released from prison. He didn't get out till 1919, but he became a leading campaigner in support of African self-government, was involved in publishing a range of pamphlets, not just on trade unions and working for Workers' Education Association, but as you can see here, on freedom for colonial peoples. In the Attlee government, he was first appointed a junior minister for the colonies, and then he was appointed as a colonial secretary. And in that role, he was actively involved in supporting, should we say, planned self-government. His main belief was that the population of various African countries would be able to be responsible for self-government if they had sufficient training through education. So he was a campaigner for adult education, and in many ways is probably, well, what he was also responsible for was effectively converting the British Empire into a federal commonwealth, and took a leading role in developing colonial development under the Attlee government. He's not very well known, I have to say. He hasn't even got a biography, but he probably was one of the most significant members of post-war Labour government. That's an obituary of him in a photograph, and that was a photograph of him dressed up as a Yoruba chief in Nigeria, just before he became a member of the Attlee government. And the final person I was going to mention was Leslie Hale, who was a Labour MP for Oldham, who lived in College Road, right next to Sydenham Hill Station, in fact, in a property called Bird Howe, which has now been demolished to provide the Dulwich Gate development. He was elected an MP for Oldham. He was a Bevanite on the left of the Labour Party, a supporter of Nye Bevan, as well as being very actively involved with the Radical MP, Fenner Brockway, in supporting the nationalists towards self-government. He was also a leading campaigner in Britain against the capital punishment, and actually published a book, as you can see there, reviewing individuals who had been hanged and were then found and not to have actually committed the crime for which they had been executed. So apologies for that being such a rush through. There's a lot more about most of those individuals in my book. I've had to do a very quick summary of some of the key individuals that I've gone through. But I hope that's of interest, and that hopefully leaves about 10 minutes or so for comments or questions. Thank you.